Hey guys, welcome back to the Uncommodified podcast and to our first unpeddling conversation. Yeah, you heard it right, unpeddling. A couple days ago, we released the intro to this podcast where Chris and I talked a little bit about our vision for that. And now we're back live with that duct tape salesman from New York City that we talked about. I know, you can't believe it's time to meet him. Chris, I want to hand it over to you to introduce our friend to everybody tonight.
Well, Mike, I actually was thinking, I can't even remember where we initially met, to be honest. But I worked with Mike for a number of years at a company where I was in marketing and Mike was in sales. And we did everything together from setting up trade shows and going on the road together. And Mike showed me the ropes of what he did and how he sold. And we went to some very sketchy places in his territory. And it was just a great time. And one thing that I've always enjoyed and appreciated about Mike was just the energy that he brought. And you always brought to different conversations and just, even going out to dinners after a long day was just always enjoyable. So, I'm really excited to get into talking to you about this idea of storytelling tonight, because you are a masterful storyteller. You are somebody who I don't really ever know if they're being serious or setting up a 5-minute joke that's going to come to fruition at the end. But I think that's one of the things that, we love about you and that defines you, is that whole idea of story and drama and being able to craft something. So really looking forward to getting into the conversation tonight.
Well, just to go back to the sketchy part of town, everything is calculated. Everything is, there's a plan for everything. And the funny thing is, I've worked with a lot of people in my life sitting in the right seat as I'm driving. And I don't know if they're ready to take my job or not. I don't know if they're like a plant coming to take my. So what I do is I just take them to the worst places ever where they're fearful for their life. And usually they go back to the main office and say, I don't want his territory. It's too scary. So. And it's worked every time.
But you shouldn't have said that, Mike, because now that strategy of yours is published.
That's okay.
This is going to be a great conversation.
Well, you get my age. Somebody told me once you get over 55, you start sharing your ideas with other people. You start teaching. Like there's a certain level where you just have to let everyone know what you were doing that whole time. You get to go back behind the curtain, I guess. So
yeah, absolutely.
But yes, Chris. Well, always a pleasure working. It was.
Yeah. And so we're welcoming now. Listen, if you see Mike's name on this podcast, you're going to ask, how do you pronounce it? Because some people call this man Mike Cace and some call him Mike Cace. What is the truth here, sir?
So the real name is Michael Cace, and it's a Croatian name. And but I'm not. It's close, So I answer to all of it, So it's never been a problem with me. My brother looks at it a little differently, but I go, it's sometimes you got to pick and choose what arguments you're going to talk about. So Casey's fine. Cace is fine.
Whatever. Just call me. As long as you're putting an order in, you're good to go, right?
That's
awesome.
Right.
Well, listen, hey, before we kick off with our real subject matter, getting on that sketchy thing, Mike, I don't know if you remember, one of the first times I went on the road with you, I had the privilege of doing some consulting and training for the company that you work with. And I was on the road with you and I was flying out of Newark. And if you remember, I said, I got a hotel in Newark. Do you remember this, Mike? And I gave you the address and we're driving there. And as we got closer and closer, you said, Tim, this must be the wrong address. And I said, why? And he goes, there's no way you're staying in this part of town. And I was like, yeah, no, my hotel's there. And you said, no, it can't be. So he pulled up in front of my hotel and you said, Tim, whatever you do, don't leave the hotel tonight. And then I got out of the car, you left me, I went in, and it's the first time there was bulletproof glass at this hotel, and they pinned you in between these doors. You had to press a buzzer to get in, and then inside it was like a wicket at a bank, and you had to slide your credit card under this little thing. It was all bulletproof glass. So, Mike, thank you for protecting my life, sir.
I was just glad that you made it back home, So
there you go. And I think you told me that was the area you grew up in, I think you said.
Yeah, right around the corner, really. I mean, once you're there a couple times, you start getting used to it. It's actually, it's where people live. I mean, it is what it is. but
There you
compared
go.
to where you're from, that it's contrast,
Yeah.
right? Big
There you
contrast.
go. Yeah, we're not knocking Newark, by the way, but just so you know, it
That's
was a
correct.
scary time. But Mike saved my bacon. So listen, let's kick this off. Let me give a bit of a context for this. So I'm going to say this is what I say about Mike as I get to introduce him. So I'm going to say duct tape salesman to diamond blades and back again. That's interesting, and we'll talk about his journey. Storyteller, sales professional, musician, magician, comedian, so many things that Mr. Casey is. And every time I call you, Mike, on the phone, I say, yo, Mr. Casey. And you say, yo, Mr. Tim. That's the way we make it work. I know it sounds a little bit crazy, Chris, but that's the way we do it. So back in about February of 2020, I had the privilege of doing some work with Mike and the company that he worked with at the time. And I asked Mike to co-partner with me to do some sessions and some training, and we brailed into and started thinking about this idea of story and the power of story and the neuroscience of story and the importance of story in the sales process and engaging with customers. And that's what we want to talk about tonight. So, Chris, I'm going to kick it off to you as we get this going tonight. How do you want to start this conversation with Mike about this idea of story? Because he's a master storyteller, and there's a lot that we can learn from him.
Well, I think maybe if we kick it off, just maybe Mike, if you want to tell us kind of maybe what does storytelling, look like or mean to you when it comes to sales? Because obviously, as Tim mentioned there, you are a masterful storyteller in a lot of ways. So, in terms of kind of when you're selling and how you incorporate storytelling into selling, like what does that look like, or why do you think it's so important?
Well, I think you have to go back to the beginning. Storytelling. Our brains are wired for storytelling. It's inherent in us. We are all storytellers, and we all look forward to stories. And what I found when it comes into sales, it helps you engage. So storytelling does a couple things. It will help you engage with your customer or the person you're talking with. It helps take your data that you have, right, and all your products, features, and benefits. And what it does, it puts it all together, so the person that's listening to your story will accept that data as part of the story. It's not You're not selling just features and benefits. You're not just talking about product. You're first of all, you have to get them into wanting to listen, almost like a coming attraction of a movie, right? Like before you even see the movie, they give you a coming attraction. And there's a lot of things we could talk about later, how the hormones and dopamine and everything works. And when you see a coming attraction on the TV, or next week on Magnum PI or whatever the show you're watching, that's done by design. That's to get you the dopamine going. Wow, that's interesting. I want to see that. I want to hear what happens there. It's like a cliffhanger, and if you look at Netflix, and I'm going to get into the sales thing in a second, but this is how powerful story is. Netflix nowadays, used to be when I was a kid, there'd be a television show, and it didn't matter what week you tuned in. It was it was a story, a 30-minute story or a 20-minute story that didn't have not connected to the week before or the week after. It didn't matter. But if you look at Netflix shows now, which is really genius because everybody's looking at the data, the neuroscience of selling. Um, Netflix keeps people interested so much with those dopamine levels, right? And what they do is they just have you keep watching. I think people call it binge watching. That they'll hit the button, forget everything else they're doing that day, right, on a Saturday, and watch these shows because they're set up on purpose. With that said, why can't we do that on sales? And
Yeah,
I think
that's
that's what
interesting.
I do. I think I look at
Yeah.
the sales part of it, and I say to myself, okay, how do I get my customer interested? How do I get his attention? How do I get him wanting to listen to me? And then how am I going to add that content or data into that story, right? And have a little bit of conflict in there, or share some history, and then I bring him into, of course, you always ask for an order at the end, but you bring him into the story. So um, it's just vital. I would say number one, it's just getting the person engaged in your conversation. That is number one. And storytelling, there's no other better way to get someone engaged with you.
Hmm. Hey, Mike, can you, I remember you telling me one time you had a secret. I mean, you sold lots of different things over your career. How long, first of all, how long have you been selling, Mike, in some way, shape, or form?
Well, 20. I'm 56, 23 years old. I mean, I've been.
So you start,
I mean, I had a couple of sales jobs before that, selling candy
yeah.
selling candy in school. But yeah, 20. I would say my career started at 23.
Okay, so for the
So a
better
long
part of
time.
30 something years you've been
Yeah.
selling. And I remember you telling me that one time you worked in a store that, and it may have been Sears, but and you sold tires, you sold different things, and you had this way of bringing people into an experience, a story of something by actually, I think you said you had what you called the tire computer.
Yeah. So yes,
Tell
that's true.
that story to our listeners, because it's really interesting how your brain worked and how you interacted with people.
right. Great story, by the way. I enjoyed it a lot.
A great
So
story because it's your
it
story.
it, no, it really is. If you so anybody that works on a terminal computer, like in a store, they're all hooked up together. If terminal A is busy, there's no reason you can't walk over to terminal B and finish a transaction or start a transaction. But when it's slow, or I'm hanging out, at a terminal with my like this on the terminal, and somebody comes over and says, "I need a battery," right? Well, one of the things I would do is say, "Oh, well, let's walk over to the battery computer," and I could have stayed where I was. There was no problem of staying exactly where I was. Now it's not manipulation. I'm not trying to hurt nobody, but I read a book once on how to set up a sale and not control, but yeah, there's some control in it, and there's little tricks. So I hate to say sales is a trick, but there's techniques, there's procedures, there's a better way of doing things, and what it does, once again, it takes down the barriers. To give you an example, same store, same everything, and they teach you to do this. If you see someone waiting, right, and even if you're doing nothing, right, you say, "Oh, what's your name?" "Bill." "Hey, Bill, I'll be right with you." And then you walk in the back room. It's like the old car salesman. You walk in the back room. You take a breath. You think about what you're going to talk about. You just finished the other deal, and you want to come out fresh. You come out that door, and you say, "Bill, how you doing?" And what happens, again, neuroscience, is that Bill, now it's not a cold call anymore. We already said hello to each other, and that little pause between the two, right, it gives them a chance to, now we're friendly. It's not the first time we're meeting. It's now the second time we're meeting. So again, my mom used to say to me, she goes, God rest her soul, she used to say, "You can sell ice to an Eskimo." And I said, "Whoa, whoa, 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 Mom, you just described a con man, right? I'm not a con man. There's a difference there, right? There's a difference there. Um, but there are things and techniques that you do, but you have to have an earnest desire to help someone. I want to start that because I have a lot of these stories and they're fun, but none of the money I ever made ever was at the expense of others. It was at the service of others. And I think that you got to be real clear, because storytellers can tell bad stories and wrong stories and untrue stories, right? There's a lot of adjectives in front of the word story: long story, short story, love story, an old story, your side of the story. I don't think there's a word that has more adjectives in front of it than story in there. So I just want to be clear, because we talk about these things and I don't want people to say, "Oh, that guy's just a con man, he's out there." No, that's not, has nothing to do with it. I'm someone that studied sales, right? Storytelling came after we met, Tim. Really, I mean, since we had that thing, we talked about stories. I've written 35 short stories, and I'm actually working on another story. So I didn't think I would love it so much, to be honest with you. It actually awoke something inside me that now I'm practicing. So I practice it every day, and that's what it is. So in sales, when you're telling stories and you're telling jokes and you're really, the desire is to make the customer or the person you're telling the story enjoy themselves. I mean, what better way to do business and to be enjoyable and to be entertaining? How's that? How about that? To be entertaining. And I think that's, you talk about, uncommodified, and I love your podcast, by the way. And I would say one of the ways I uncommodify myself is I try to be entertaining, at least. So
Well, and I think too, Mike, what you said there is very important, and I think an important thing for people to pay attention to is it is so easy to equate story with maybe almost manipulation even sometimes, and I think that's where having a core belief in what you're selling is valuable for the customer, and that you're using story as a way to bring them into a narrative that you believe is good for them, rather than
that's correct.
bringing them into a narrative that you believe benefits you and is selfish. And I think
That's
that's
right.
a very important thing that you said, because you're right. There's a lot of people who tell bad stories and who are
That's right.
selfish about what they want to sell, and they don't really care if it works for the person. They'll tell them anything to get them to buy it. And I think that's
That's
a
right.
very important thing that you said, is that telling stories for the right reason to bring people into a narrative that you have something you believe can benefit their business. That is what we're talking about tonight. And I think that's a very important and a very good delineation that you made there for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I try not, you try not to be the hero when you're telling a story, especially in sales. With when you deal with the customer, you don't want to make yourself the hero of the story. That could be a little awkward. If you turn out to be the narrative, then you're really losing something. When I tell stories in sales, you have to look at it as like a tree, right? Top to bottom. I start on the bottom and I go up, and I know what I'm going to talk about in that tree. And there's limbs on those trees, right? So you got to be careful that you don't go out too much on it, spend too much time on a limb, right? Because you want to stay in that narrative. So, that's something I was thinking about the other day when you just brought up. The narrative is important, and it's also important to plan that narrative so you don't get distracted. It's very easy to get
Hmm.
distracted when you're telling a story.
Hmm. Oh, that's a good point. So Mike,
Yeah.
I mean, there's two parts to this conversation. So you have a story that you have architected. Maybe it's a story about your company and your company and your company's history, or your company's history as it relates to the products or services it markets or sells or makes. There's a story around that. There's a story. There's a human story of the people who work there, and then your customer has a story. So here's a question. So how do you elicit the customer story from your experience? How do you get people telling you their story? Because there has to be part of that. It can't be a one-way street. So what's your best advice for people listening on how to help the customer unlock their own story so that we can connect those two together?
Great question. And so one of my goals, I always wanted to. I became an officiant. I did my first wedding a couple weeks ago, and it was one of those check boxes I always wanted to do. And one of the things about being an officiant, you have to meet the bride and the groom, and you want to know their story. And it's funny because when you ask them for their story, they don't know what to say, right? So a good storyteller, I think, knows how to connect the dots for people. It's all about connecting dots, really. So to give you an example, and I'll get to the sales one in a second, but with the two people that I was talking to, and I said, "Well, tell me about yourself, right?" And or tell me about and they really didn't know where to start. And then you have to give them something. And I would say, "Well, how did you meet?" As soon as
Hmm.
you gave them something that they have a dot they connect, they go right into it. It's a reference point. So a lot of times when I for a customer, I recently did this not too long ago. I walked in. I wanted to learn about the guy's business, and I wanted to hear his story. And we're sitting in his office, and he said, the business has been there for 20 something years. And I said, boy, if these walls could talk, what would they say? Right? And they will tell you, when did you start? I think as long as you give someone a reference,
Hmm.
right, have a good question, um, they would love to. People love their own stories, and sometimes they wait for an opportunity to tell it. And really, I'm just giving them that opportunity to tell it.
So, Mike, that's a great point. And you made a comment about connecting dots or finding that reference point. And I think that's brilliant. And those of you listening, I think that's a great idea for starting. If you can help the customer find a reference point or a dot to start on, and then I guess, Mike, it becomes a game of connecting dots. Connecting my dot
Absolutely,
with the customer's dot and the
that's correct.
similarity in our stories, because I'm assuming that similarity and that familiarity that breeds a certain powerful feeling that is an important part of having a great conversation and ultimately seeing if there's a reason to engage in the selling process with a person?
In my hometown, not my home. Well, I now live where my mother grew up, and one of my accounts is in that town. And I walked in there, and there was a lady that was around the age of my mother. And it's so funny because I was talking to her, and I said, my mom grew up here, and it turned out, what's your mom's name? And they knew each other. Sometimes, like things just work out. If you set up, if you ask the right questions, like little things, like I wondered, like I'm sorry, I should back up. She said she grew up in this town that she was in. I knew my mother grew up in the town, so I wanted to bring that up. So sometimes you have to listen to their dots, right? And then what I try to do is look for the what's familiar in their story, right? And I try to blend myself into that story too. If the guy says he was on vacation in Florida, hey, where'd you go in Florida? I was there, and little things like that. And again, it's just sometimes you have to help people who aren't storytellers tell their story. They want to tell it always. They just might not know how to tell it.
Do you know what's a really good story about Florida, Mike?
What is that?
Do you remember that one time when we were in Florida and Tim decided to try chewing tobacco for the first time?
Oh yes. I thought we weren't going to talk about that story ever again. There's some stories we can talk about.
That was
you segued into it. We had to go there.
Yeah, that was that was. Hold on, now that was Brian Fortner. That was he's a bad
Yes.
man. Now, not everybody knows Brian Fortner. Normally a good man, but Brian Fortner challenged me if I should have some chewing tobacco, and I can guarantee I'm a weakling when it comes to chewing tobacco. It was not my finest moment. Let's just put it that way.
No, but it was a very good story.
It was a very good story.
And to get back to the conversation, I had to throw that in about Florida. But I think, Mike, I was having a conversation the other week with somebody, and I think this whole thing around, whether it's stories or other things with, customers or prospects when we're selling, I think this is part of the art of selling, is that a lot of people don't know how to articulate the things we need them to actually figure out if we can work well with people. So, as you were talking about, almost when you asked that, the couple who's getting married, what's your story? I think in business and in sales, a lot of people would draw blanks if you asked it that way. And I think you're totally right that a good storyteller or a good, conversationalist is going to be able to pull a story out of somebody, because a lot of people, I think, would struggle to articulate exactly what their story is if it's phrased a certain way or something. And then, you just get really anemic, answers, and the conversation doesn't really go really good places. But I think what you said there about, being able to not only communicate a good story about, your company and who you are and why you want to work with somebody. I think, how do we creatively pull stories out of people, I think is also a discipline that we need to really work on, because I don't think a lot of people can articulate their story well.
Right. And it's knowing the right questions to ask, right? To have them down. And and I got to go back to the beginning where you say you really have to be sincere about it. I used to joke, I'm sincere even if I don't mean it, you have to somewhat really have an earnest desire to have a relationship with somebody. And, there's a lot of empathy sometimes, telling a story, especially in sales. A lot of the stories I tell aren't always happy stories. Some of them are downright ugly stories of failures. And I do share a lot of and I think that creates empathy with my prospect, and then he might share his. But when you're vulnerable and you open up a little bit, again, it helps you engage, and that's what the storytelling does. See, storytelling, it's survival. I can't tell you how important that is. And it was made, again, Tim, if you remember the conversation, it goes back to the cavemen, right? Where once they started hanging out and then going out hunting and coming back, they had to tell stories like, don't eat the green berries. Og died eating the green berries. Don't pet the alligator, right? Somebody had to be the first one to say, don't pet alligators, right? Because otherwise you go up and you pet an alligator. You don't know, right? So you have to, storytelling is really, it's a survival instinct. It's how we help each other. It's how we protect one another, right? It's how we share. So I think you don't have to be a master storyteller. I think it's you just have to be open and honest, and and share.
Hmm. Well, and you said you use the word sincerity, I think, and that's where it's going to. So, I mean, if you're sincere, the way I look at this, if you're sincere, and if you think of story, story is really just a relationship. Our story is our relationship to our past. You know, our a story of our past is how we relate to our past. The story of where we are now is how we're relating, and the story of our future, we'll call it our vision or our goals, or call it whatever you want, or whether it's a corporate goal or a personal goal, it's the story I'm writing of my future. So it's all connected to relationship, and that's where,
Absolutely.
Mike, I would say, you know, my experience with you is that you shine in that area of relationship. You have deep relationships with your customers. You have customer relationships that date back 20, 30 years, I think.
Absolutely. One of my biggest blessings, I have to tell you, is that I have the same customers for over 34 years. I mean, it's really a blessing. It's truly a blessing. One thing, back to that computer going back and forth. When I give a seminar, or if I'm training in front of someone and I'm talking about telling a story that's time sensitive, I will stand left, walk right as I progress into the future of the story. I'll start on this side of the room, and then I'll actually walk, because when they're watching, they're seeing the right to left, and that's very powerful. That's very powerful, and it's little. So these are, first I want to thank you for giving me a topic that usually takes 8 weeks to cover. That's
You're welcome.
probably this. Yeah, I mean, I
This
try
is
to
a short
try to take what you
story,
can.
Mike. It's a short story.
Yes, yes, it is. And so we're just, and again, we're talking like friends. So it's very hard to come up with a presentation of storytelling. I can answer some questions, but people should know. It's almost like acting. Tim, you had my number when we second time I think we met. I think it was in Vegas for a second time, and I did something, and you said, and it was very funny. It was very good. Everyone loved it. And you came over to me at the end. You said, that was rehearsed, wasn't it? And I said, yeah, it kind of was. And it's funny because and you picked it up because you probably do it too. I think everybody that does presentations, we all do it. And you just get good at it and that's the other thing too. Whenever you tell your stories, you should be very excited about them and tell it like it's the first time. It's
Hmm.
very important. I love Broadway. Broadway actors to me are the best actors. Anybody on stage to me is one of the, because every night they have to make you believe it was the first time doing it, right? So
Hmm.
um, that's power, because you have to, again, sincere even if you don't mean it. That's where that comes from,
Yeah.
because
But
they
Mike, that goes
deserve
back
to
to the
have
thing.
that energy.
Yeah, but that, Mike, that goes back to what we're saying, is that so insincerity. So an actor, I mean, this goes to rehearsal. So just because you've rehearsed your story and you know what you want to say and it's your story, it's not that it's insincere. You own it. It's like an actor. And so rehearsal is such a big part of this, because the more we rehearse our story and we know how to tell it, again, not to manipulate people, not, again, really
Right.
important. This podcast is called Unpeddling. This isn't telling stories to peddle your shit and shove down crap down people's throat that they don't need and manipulate them with pulling on their heartstring with some story that really isn't quite true. That is not what we're talking about tonight. But we are talking about how you have a story, I have a story, and when we can find those connective dots between our personal or professional story, or frankly, even more importantly, if the customer has a story of what they want to accomplish this year, and frankly, you can help them write their story, then you're a great partner. But
That's
if
right.
they are writing a story, again, if they've written a story of more sales and greater margin, and you can help them write that story, then you are a phenomenal partner. But if you can't help
Absolutely.
them write their story, then you're not that important to them at the end of the day, is my supposition. And so I think this is a really big part of it, is as we discover the story. And when we think of story, sometimes I think the problem is we use story and the word fable together. A fable is a kind of story, but a story doesn't have to be a fable or a lie. A story is
Right.
just a narrative, a description of the past, present, or the future, articulated in a way that makes sense to the person writing it and the people hearing it. And that to me is the art and craft of communication, of selling. And it isn't about peddling our wares and doing all that, but it is about understanding that if we can help people accomplish or write the next chapter of their story, we're valuable to them. That's my passionate belief on this subject.
Absolutely. And I want to add something that it's in your podcast, and I love the Uncommodified podcast because storytelling. Now, see if you can follow me on this. Storytelling is one of the best ways to brand yourself, and I'll tell you why.
Hmm.
And your customer ends up branding you. So when in branding, in the world of branding, right, you sometimes don't get to make your own brand, right? You put the narrative out there, but your customer is the one that gives you the brand. How is he going to remember you? Yeah, hey, I saw Mike yesterday. He was a funny guy, right, or whatever it is, or whatever the brand. Oh, he's on time. The more I believe you uncommodify, the more you brand yourself or you get branded, and that is this, and that's what we're doing, right? We're How many people will actually ask someone their story or share a story? It's it's not easy. I mean, a lot of people are even myself. I stutter. I don't know what to say sometimes, but it works itself out. As long as you have that narrative, and before you know it, you're engaging with that customer, and he's going to remember that. Remember what somebody once told me: it's not what you say to a customer. It's not even what your story says to the customer. It's how you made them feel when you were at that visit, right? It's all about emotion. All those hormones, the what is it, oxytocin, the endorphins, the dopamine, cortisol, I think adrenaline, right? There's a reason. I know I'm starting to babble, but there's a reason why they don't. When you get in an airplane, they give you the how to put the seatbelt on in the beginning because you're calm. You could pay attention. If they gave it to you while the plane was crashing, not too many people would listen. Their adrenaline's up, their cortisol's up. So the storytelling really is designed to to release those chemicals in the brain because we need that. We need that to feel good, to feel comfortable, and you have to know which ones to use because I've told stories at the wrong time. That's another thing too. There's a right time to tell the story, and there's a wrong tell this time. If the guy's building is burning down, it's probably not a good time to say, "Hey, you got a minute for a story?" It just doesn't. It just doesn't work. They don't want to listen. You know. But if I walked in, but check this out. This is how dopamine works. If I walked in and my clothes were all ripped up and I was bleeding and I said, "Oh my God, you're not going to believe what just happened to me," I would have everybody's attention immediately. And it's not because it's that because that hormone in their brain went off and they need to know now what happened. And that's kind of like what we need to do when we tell to engage that person. It has to be something powerful like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So.
no, what, it makes a lot of sense. So, Chris, when you think of this idea of storytelling and in the world that you work in and the team that you lead across North America, I mean, what does storytelling look like in your world, and why do you think it's so important for your customers and for your team to understand this thing and what it can do for us?
Well, I think going back to what Mike said is, I think the story and and having some being very genuine about the story that you're telling or wanting to get from people. I think it's almost like that. It's like almost like grease for the whole sales process and getting people to open up and really being able to kind of form that initial relationship. And I think Mike, as you and I've been able to observe how you sell in a number of occasions, and being on the road with you a number of times. And it's like, that's the one thing I would say, you are very, very genuine when you're with customers because you want to be there. You love being there. And so I think too, as I think about this for myself and others. I think it's how do we be genuine about the stories we're telling and wanting to listen to from customers and prospects, because I think that's a unlocking of kind of that personal side and developing that deeper relationship. Like Tim said before, Mike, you've had customers for over 30 years, I think the only way you have customers that actually continue to engage with you for that long is by building a sense of personal relationship. And a lot of times that even, spans into friendship. And I think that's where sharing stories and understanding who people are and who you are, I think that's the power of it. And when you can craft stories around that kind of come around products and come around your business and all that kind of stuff. It's that same type of connection point. Obviously, crafting personal stories and business stories is different and you have to nuance it. But at the end of the day, the end goal is the exact same. It's how do you drive that deeper connectivity with what you're talking about? And I think that's where, for me, it's, re-understanding and looking at this power of story, with customers and how we can drive deeper relationships.
And I don't know, you guys, American Idol made its way up to Canada, right? You have Canada Idol or The Voice. Have you ever watched The Voice or American Idol or those
Yeah, we
shows?
have. Yeah. We
Okay,
we
well,
see American things in Canada.
it makes all right. So here's the thing, but look how powerful story is. Here's a great example of how powerful. Chris is saying, we watch American Idol or The Voice. What's the first thing we do? We see the person's story. And usually it's a hard luck story, right? I was beat up as a kid. Nobody liked me. I was bullied in school, right? People used to step up. Now the guy's going to sing in about 5 minutes, but we're spending, uh, um, 3 minutes watching a video of how his life sucked, right? Creating empathy, for
Hmm.
that, right? He didn't even start even singing yet, and the people at home are going, "Aw," right? There are times in American Idol or The Voice, this person with the better story wins. It shouldn't be
Hmm.
called The Voice. It should be called The Story. The voice is a commodity, right?
Yeah.
Everybody has a voice, and it's the
Hmm.
story that separates them. Hollywood, everything we're talking about, there's a science behind this. And yeah, I could see how people say, "Oh no, you're manipulating people." Well, yeah, I guess you are. In some way, you are. But you want to be entertaining, right? You want to be entertaining. You want to do the right things, right? But it's so powerful. And every time, and you know, Tim, after we met, I helped you with that project. Um, I thought I grew another eye, like they call it the storyteller's eye. Once you know the storyteller, once you tell many, you get to recognize stories too, right? You get to recognize maybe stories that are very familiar, and then that's good too because you know where your customer's going, or where the guy's going with that story, and now you're already with them. You're like that around the bend, you're gonna meet up somewhere, and I can see it. I can see where we're gonna connect, right? I know it's just maybe another couple sentences, and we found that common thing. And but it's a right way of doing it. It's very powerful, and once you could see it, just like that American Idol. I can't watch that show now without looking at the story and saying, I see what that guy did there. I see what he did,
Hmm. Hmm.
and that's what
Well,
they do.
there's
Anyway,
there's powerful emotions going on, and again,
yeah,
I want to be really clear if you're listening to this podcast today or tonight or whenever you're listening that look, we're not talking about manipulation for the purpose of exploiting people. Mike was clear about that, so it's a fine line here. But the reality is that really great salespeople who are really great storytellers, and frankly, Mike is one of the best I've ever encountered in the real world, not just theoretical or somebody who teaches or consults and says they used to do it and they never really did. Not those kind of people. Mike is a gritty on the road. Right now, he's talking to us from a
every day.
hotel in Pennsylvania. He's a road dog. He's been doing this a long time. But what the masterful piece is being able to listen to the customer story and figure out where your story connects and fits in, not in a manipulative way, not because you're lying about your story and trying to jam it inside the customer's story to pull on that empathetic string so you can somehow sell more. That's not what
Right.
it's about. But Mike, that's one thing that I think you're brilliant at is that you're able to listen well. And I think this is another big part of it is some people are great at asking the customer to tell their story, but they don't fucking listen to the customer story. They
That's
nod
correct.
appropriately and think they're listening, but they're not listening. They're just waiting for their time to tell what they want to tell, which they were going to tell anyways. And that's manipulation. But a great storyteller, a great sales professional storytelling craft, a person who's really good at it for the right reasons, knows how to listen to that customer story, understand that story, and feel it, and then push their own story inside of it. And when you nest it, sort of like Russian dolls, when you nest your story inside the customer story, that's where the power lies. And that's
Correct.
really critical. And Mike, I've seen you do that, and I've watched you do that. And I remember, again, I've been on the road with you, and we were in New York City, we were in Newark, we were in New Jersey. These are tough, these are gritty sales places. I mean, there's lots of gritty sales places around the world, but these are gritty sales places. And when you can understand the craft within those environments, that is a powerful thing. Mike, I want you to tell the story, if you remember, and it's not so much connected to sales, but it's a very interesting story. Do you remember when we did our session together? You told a powerful story about encountering a deaf woman.
Yes.
I think it might have been at your doctor's office. I can't even remember, but
Yes. Yes.
just tell that story, because there's something powerful that I remember when you told that story to a group of men.
Yeah.
The emotion that it touched in them was so powerful. I remember it. It
Yeah.
was powerful. And
It's
normally what
you
happens in
know.
Vegas stays in Vegas, but tonight we're going to bring
Yeah.
it out of the bag.
So I had they can't see it on the podcast, but I had a Mohs surgery done on my face. They took out a real big piece. Looks good now here, especially on this camera. But I was in my dermatologist office, and I was when you have Mohs surgery, you go in, they take a little piece, you go back into a waiting room, they check it out to see if they got all of what they need to get, and then if they have to go back, then they bring you back into this to the little operating room, and vice versa. So as I'm sitting in the waiting room, I'm talking to a girl, lady, and she's there, and I love to talk, like tell stories, stuff, and we're talking back and forth, and then I said, you don't really want to be too personal, like what are you getting done, kind of thing. But I already have a bandage like this on my face, so she knows what I'm getting done, and she looks pretty good, to be honest with you. And I'm like, so we're talking, and I said, so what do you do, kind of thing, and she goes, well, I'm an interpreter, and I interpret for deaf people. So I'm here with one of my clients, and we are, and I'm talking when the doctor has to give the message. She interprets using sign language. I said, "Well, isn't that interesting?" So, sure enough, in the hall in the room, uh, she comes out. The deaf woman comes out, and she sits across from the interpreter. And then we all started talking. And someone told me once a long time ago, if you're talking to someone who's deaf and there's an interpreter, talk to the person who's deaf. Don't talk to the interpreter. The interpreter knows how to do it, right? It's very rude, actually, and I knew that, so I used that. I right up to the lady, I'm talking to her, I'm going back and forth, and it was great. And we're going and we're talking, and now she's telling me her story, right? The deaf girl through the interpreter. It was fantastic. Towards the end of the conversation, um, she said to the interpreter, as she's saying to me, she goes, "You might be surprised, but I am a PhD or doc, of this, and I'm such a learned person." She was giving me all her degrees, and I was like, "Ah, that makes sense, right?" I said, "You could study in peace and quiet," and then she laughed. She laughed, and here's what the thing was, and if you ever heard a deaf person laugh, it's the most beautiful sound in the world. It really is. And it was a great connection with that one. You know what? I think if you found her somewhere, she would remember me. She would remember me, and I her. But yeah, that was a powerful thing. Not too many people can make deaf people laugh. So
No, but you can. But when you told that the story, there's several things going on in there when I listened to it. So one thing, I mean, one is just again how we often use excuses to say, well, I can't get this person's story or tell this person's story because they can't hear me. And sometimes, frankly, it's not physical deafness. It's people can hear, but they're deaf somehow. They're tone deaf to understanding what's going on in the
yes,
story. The other thing is that we are like interpreters, and sometimes we have to help the customer interpret their own story. You talked about that. Like sometimes a customer doesn't even really understand their own story. And we become interpreters of their story as we elicit it and draw it out and call it out from them. Because these people work in an environment where, again, depending on the environment, they're buying stuff that isn't really sexy. It isn't really exciting. It isn't an exciting world. They're brokering deals. They're a purchaser. They're whatever. And they lose track of the excitement of their own story. Companies that started, 40, 50 years ago and started on the back of a truck with $2 in a garage. And now they're this and all this stuff. They don't fall in love with their own story. They no longer can hear it. And that story reminds me that sometimes we become the interpreter in this process where we call out the story of people who have difficulty communicating. And as we call it out, we can hear it. And the fact that you could make a deaf woman laugh is all about the power of communication. You can be speaking and hearing one another even when you're not. And that to me is what story is all about. And so listen, we don't have time to explore all the neuroscience of story tonight and all of that stuff. But if you're listening, really, this is, again, the take home that I would really encourage you to think about is, what does storytelling look like for you in your world, your sales world? Why is it critical to understand the customer story? What is your story? Rehearse your story, understand it, but become masterful at asking the customer to bring you into their story and help them be that interpreter that pulls that out of them so that they can understand and get excited about their own story anymore. Because for many of them, they just have a job. They don't have a story anymore. They don't have an exciting story, a new story, a future story. They just have a job. And that's a story that sometimes just sucks for them. And we're giving them a great gift, Mike, I think, when we ask them great questions and they get a chance to tell us their story and there's something exciting in it. And there's powerful. And listen, at the end of it, you might sell them something and that's cool, or you might not because your stories don't collide and you're not on the same page. We even use that idea. And that's okay because they can't close everybody. But at the end of the day, are we calling forth the stories of our customers? To me, that's part of what this whole conversation's about for me. Listen, let's go around the horn as we finish up. We'll just go around the horn. Mike, we're going to give you the last word. Chris, what's your thought on this as we leave this subject tonight? What do you want our listeners to think about as when they finish this podcast and press stop and they're done? What do you want them to think about in relationship to this thing about story?
Well, I think, one of the things I'm just pondering and going to take away for myself is that whole thing of, helping people discover their story. And especially, Mike, as you talked about the length of time that you've been dealing with some of the people you have, and, in the business I'm in, we've just gone through a transition of a generation. And, it's interesting. And I was having this conversation today, actually. It's like over time, you have to make sure that you don't lose the story that always was there. And I think, as salespeople who, maybe we've been around for a long time, I think, the opportunity to help new people in our customers' companies, different generations to rediscover and re-understand the story that they're actually inheriting and living in, I think is very important and can be very powerful. Mike, I've been on the road with you, and I've seen you talking to the owner who's more your age, and then you talk to the counter guy who's more probably my age about something that happened 15 years ago, and bringing him into that narrative. And I think that's for me, that's a big takeaway is, as salespeople, we have the opportunity to continue helping the customers, employees, and people rediscover and understand what the connection point is. I think that's very powerful.
Yeah, for sure.
Totally agree.
And the other thing I would think, Chris, as you're saying that, the way I look at this too, and I think it's important is, think about even new employees that come into your own company. They don't know the story of their own companies. And we take them and we give them all this product training. We teach them about products and we teach them about the computer and their software. But do we teach them the story of this company? Do we teach them the journey of this company? And do they, with the same passion, can they go out and tell the story like the owner of this company who started from scratch? Can they tell that story with the same passion? And that's another thing I would say. If you're a leader in a company and you have people that come in new, don't just train them about your products. Don't just train them about the feature and benefit of your product. Teach them the power of your story, where you've come from, where you are, where you're going, and why there's chapters still to be written. That's what will light people on fire. And then we can bring our products within that context, and it's a different type of conversation. That's what comes to my mind. Listen, as we finish up, Mike, my question to you, I got 2 questions, and we'll give you the last word. One is, what is uncommodifying, unpeddling, for you look like? What is it when you're at your unpeddling, uncommodified best, being your unique self? What are you doing? And the second thing is, as we finish up, how do you want to challenge people to enter into this idea of story?
So on the first one, for me when I uncommodify myself, I think about why I'm doing it, and might be ego, might be some other things, but I want to be remembered. And I think the more modified you are, the more memorable you probably are. Probably, right? Who are they going to turn to first? Right? Something that sticks out. Maybe that's a story. Hey, the car. Mike told me about a story, but it's how the brain puts things together. Right? The more stories you tell, the more they're going to connect with your customer, and he might remember you for it. So again, for me, it just separates me from everybody else. And if everybody else started telling stories, I'd probably find something else, whatever. But whatever it is, right? So for me, the more uncommodified I am, the more memorable I want to be. That's what it takes. That's my takeaway. It just separates. It's what the word is, right? It just separates, and it's a nice separation. And I would challenge people this, and I do this. So I would. There's a couple things. Get yourself a journal and write down your stories every day. One of the reasons people don't tell stories is they feel they don't have any. And that's simply not true. They have so many stories. They just can't remember them. They don't know where to find them. They don't know how to recall them. And it is true. I tell a lot of the same stories, every day. I tell the same jokes all the time. They're funny. I use them, but I practice it. I know where to find them. Like, my customer's 34 years. I say, you can't act like a skunk for 34 years and someone not get whiff of you, right? So I know I'm doing the right things. And right. So I challenge your listeners, right, to buy a nice journal, a leather bound journal, spend the $20, $30, $40. It'll be priceless by the time you're done with it. And write your stories of the day. If something funny things happen, jokes you hear, pull over to the side of the road in a safe place, write them down. I think you said it, Tim, there's something magical that happens when a pen hits paper. And we have the stories. Challenge them to write it down and to read it maybe on their birthday every year. Start from the beginning, and you'll see that life is short, but there's a lot of stories in that life. So that's it. That's what I got.
That's a great challenge, and I would say it's from a business perspective. Also, again, write your story. Don't. It can't be somebody else's story. What's your story? What's your life story? What's your business story? What's your career story? What story do you want to create? What story do you want to connect with? What customer story do you want to elicit? And listen, as you do, here's my challenge to you. As you touch these things and think about these things, as you rehearse your story, as you write your stories down, share them with us. Email me at tim@theuncommodified.com or connect with me on social media. Let Mike and Chris and I know what you're doing with this conversation, what it evokes in you, what stories it brings up for you. And as a sales professional, as you listen to these particular series of podcast episodes that we're doing, Unpeddling, our challenge to you is to stand out among the crowd, the din of salespeople out there, and be different for the right reasons. Unpeddle yourself. Don't just be that guy on the side of the street in New York City pulling open his jacket, God bless him, peddling his wares. Be the guy who, when you open up your jacket, or be the lady when you open up that vest of yours, are there stories hanging inside there, or just gold watches? Let them be stories. Let those be the gold. The stories be the gold. And as you do, let us know what you're doing with it. Connect with us on social media and let us know. Have a great day. Thanks for listening.